بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي جعل الصيام جنة للصائمين من النار وجعله مطهرا لنفوسنا من الذنوب والآثام، ثم الصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for making fast to be a protection for those who fast from punishment, and also fast to be a way to purify our nafs and our souls from sinfulness and forgetfulness. We convey our greeting and salutation to the Holy Prophet of Islam and his pure progenies. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the second night of our program, the Ramadan program 2022. Inshallah, we all pray together that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make us among those who have the privilege to fast properly during this month. يقول الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن الحكيم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. For those who confess allegiance and faith, fasting has become an obligation on you in the same manner that it was made an obligation on nations before you, so that you may attain God consciousness and taqwa. Since this is the second night, we start with a brief recap of the foundation that we laid last night for our conversation and discussion. By looking at the verse 183, or at the verses 183 to 186 or 187, Surah Al-Baqarah last night, I pointed out that to understand truly what the meaning of fasting is, we really need to go deeper into understanding Quran and the way Quran presents these four or five verses outlining one of the most fundamental principles of faith in Islam, which is fasting. And that conversation somehow led us to the notion of nadm and order and coherence in the Holy Quran. But I was trying to explain last night that in addition, if we were to approach the Quran purely in kind of an atomistic manner, that look at one verse by itself in singularity, separated from other verses, it would not give us justice in understanding the whole picture. And the only way we can understand the whole picture is to look at the context and the relationship between the verses before, after, as well as the running theme that goes through the chapter itself. And this is something that very few people in the past developed it, but contemporary scholars and commentators have spent a huge amount of time to discuss this, that no, to reject the Orientalists, contemporary Orientalists, that they read the Quran and they say, Quran might be a revelation, but it is a jagged revelation. It's not organized properly, because they come from and understanding the Judeo-Christian understanding of a book written down by an author and presented. So they have started developing this idea of looking deeper into the concept of nadm and order and coherence. In attempting to understand what Allah means by a particular verse or a particular concept, we really need to use all the tools at our disposal so that we comprehend and have a better picture. One of them is to look at why this verse or these verses have been located or positioned exactly where they have been positioned, not somewhere else. We have repeatedly in the Holy Quran verses that talk about salat and Sawm and everything else, but the verses that clearly obligates fasting and lays the foundation for fasting have been laid down in this particular context, in which the previous verses, the theme of the previous verses talks about social responsibility, talks about the concept of truth, and the one after, again, talks about jihad, struggle, etc., etc. So there must be some relationship between the two. This is something that if ever, I believe many years ago, a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, when we began the tafsir al-Quran, at the beginning, I briefly touched upon the issue of coherence in relationship to understanding Quran. But we leave that for another occasion, inshallah. The overall theme, as I indicated last night, the overall theme for the discussion during these nights is going to be fasting and spirituality, the relationship between fasting and spirituality. That means that sometimes we have to break it down into various other small themes that we address so that clearly the ground is laid down and we understand, we move towards. Since the theme itself has 2 words, 2 phrases, fasting and spirituality, we need to have a clear understanding or a clear definition, a working definition of these 2, exactly what we mean by fasting and what we mean by spirituality. Because concept of fasting in the Western tradition, as I explained a little bit later, has many connotations that may not agree with the understanding of Sawm that we have in Islam. Spirituality also has many meaning in Western tradition that may not agree with what we believe when we talk about spirituality in our faith. Luckily, when it comes to fast or fasting and Sawm, there seems to be some kind of a convergence when it comes to the definition. Fasting in the English language is voluntary abstention or abstaining from something for a limited amount of time. And most basically and traditionally, fasting involves abstention from food and drink for a short period of time, whether it is for a religious purpose or whether it's for some other reasons. That is called fasting. Sawm, however, in Arabic literature, is a verbal noun that literally means to desist from something and to leave or to abandon something. In the most basic understanding of Sawm and Siyam, you abandon, I'll explain in a minute, you abandon drink and food and some other activities for the sake of conforming to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if you go to the Jahili literature before Islam, they used to train their horses and their camels to withstand thirst and hunger. so that in major calamities that they might face in their life, they become more stronger and able to not to remain weak. And they used to use the phrase "sawmul faras," where the faras or the horse is abstaining from food or drink or anything as part of the training. So in essence, what we have here is the month of Ramadan is going to be, from an Islamic point of view, a period of training, strengthening. Islam does not focus primarily on the physical reality outside. The main goal is the spiritual component. Physical reality simply becomes secondary issue. Otherwise, the primary goal in fasting, if we, as I pointed out last night during Khutbah al-Sha'baniyah, for example, of Sahif al-Sajjadiyah, dua number 44, Imam Zayn al-Abidin in Sahif al-Sajjadiyah, or the Holy Prophet in Khutbah al-Sha'baniyah, the foundation that they laid down to bring to the attention of the audience that were present at that time wasn't the fact that this, if you were to fast, it has some physical benefits. Everything about this activity leads towards the spiritual part. Why? Because at the end of the day, we as human beings is a mix, a unique mix of physical as well as the spiritual. What gives credit, what makes it advantageous for human being or worthy of human being for the sujda, the prostration or the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the malaika is not this physical reality. It's the heart, the soul. The heart, again, as I pointed out last night, is not just the flesh, which is the size of your fist, that pumps blood in your chest. No, it's the soul, the inner reality of every human being. That is the one that makes a distinction between humans and non-humans, and animals. And again, last night briefly I touched upon this. When this heart, the soul, becomes sick or hardened, as Quran talks about, Quran immediately comes back to use a different narrative. In kal an'am o hum adall. If this heart, which is the framework to make a judgment as who you are, it's the criteria by which we should somehow use it to discern truth from falsehood. If that heart is locked, becomes sick, then naturally we become lower than the beast. As for the safilin that Quran talks about, only fits where we forget about the role of the heart in our life, and material becomes the dominant factor. Now, recently, if you look at, particularly with the advent of keto diet and few other things, and we have huge coverage and extensive coverage about fasting in various shapes or form. Whether it is intermittent fasting, dry fasting, non-dry fasting, how window fasting, etc., etc. There is a huge amount of literature about the benefit, the physical benefit of fasting. But the physical benefit of fasting as a principle rests on one fundamental principle, on one fundamental understanding, that giving your body needs to be given a break from processing food for a short period of time or a long period of time so that the body recovers. What about the spiritual part? Fasting in Islam, as I said, it looks at the physical as a secondary issue. You access the spiritual through going through the physical. But what about the issue of the spiritual part? Spiritual part has similar, if we look at our ahadith, has similar kind of narrative. constant forgetfulness and absent-mindedness towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, constant sinfulness and shortcoming destroys that inner ability to be able to reflect what we call tajalli and the manifestation of Allah on our hearts, and ultimately reaches a point where heart does not reflect anything. Month of Ramadan is supposed to be the month in which we gives it a break from everything that negates that possibility and destroys that possibility. And this is the concept that most monotheistic faith, theistic, both in Islam, Judo-Christian, and so on, inshallah, we will briefly address the concept of fast that existed in the previous nation as the verse talks about it. But this is something that they believe in. Our spirit, the fundamental principle is that our spirit needs to be cleansed and purified regularly if we can, if not at least once a year during the month of fasting, the month of Ramadan. It's a month of primarily cleansing the spirit. Now, Sharia is what we call following the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is an avenue, a conduit into achieving that goal. You cannot just willy-nilly decide that I'm going to fast in a way that I want to, rather than in a way that Islam has prescribed. And Quran and Sharia talk about three different levels. Number one, the practices that we do on a regular basis. Number two, the goal is beyond the practice to go to the thought and somehow be able to change the way we think. And ultimately, to go to the heart and the spirituality and remove the signs of all the sinfulness and sins that exist in our hearts. On these three levels. Based on where we are with regard to our understanding of Islam, our fast becomes divided into three different levels. If you look at the juristical books, that they simply, Kitab al-Sawm, they talk about fasting in a regular manner. And if you were to violate any of these principles, Mubtalat al-Sawm, etc., then naturally there is a ramification that you have to deal with, whether it's you have to pay kafara, you have to do qada, etc., etc. Number two is what they call sometimes in some of the literature, Sawm al-Muttaqin, the fasting of the elite, those who have been able to cleanse to a degree their soul and free themselves from nafs al-ammar. This is the second level. Once you get to this stage, inshallah tomorrow I'll try to expand on it, we begin to have some kind of control on the way we think as the spirituality increases. And ultimately, Sawm al-Arifin, these are the fasting of those very elite, the exceptional ones, the select elite, that their fasting is totally different from everything else. If in the second category, we try to control our thoughts and somehow avoid sinfulness, in the third category, anything but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is removed from the heart. And it leads to a different types of fasting. So, Sawm al-Fiqh, which is the basic level, is what we have to start with during the month of Ramadan. At least try to do our best not to violate any of the prescribed laws, the do's and the don'ts. Primarily in the Sawm al-Mu'mineen or Sawm al-Fiqh rests on do's and don'ts. You have to stop eating from, say, 20 minutes imsak time before the early morning prayer. You can break your fast 15 minutes after sundown. In between, you have to do X, Y, and Z. These are primarily resting on do's and don'ts within what we call Som al-Fiqh. It's the most basic deed-orientated fasting. Certain things you don't do, certain things you do, and you have to be conscious of what violates these rules and juristical opinion, because then you will have to suffer the consequences if you don't pay attention. Please, sisters and brothers, I have said this in the past, please clarify your position vis-a-vis your marja'iyya and taqleed, because during the month, not only for the month of Ramadan, or at least for the month of Ramadan, because ultimately if you don't do it and you violate certain rules, if you haven't done it deliberately, then the consequences are going to be dire, particularly for the fasting. So make sure at the beginning of the month, you really understand exactly what is the opinion of your grand scholar and what he thinks vis-a-vis certain things about the month of Ramadan. Now, Sawmul Muttaqeen, which is the fasting for the select, not the elite, the select, is a unique type of fasting that we try to eliminate all the impurities that have consequences for and tarnishes the soul. Number one, sins in all shape or form. When Khutbah al-Sha'baniyah was delivered by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the last Friday of the month of Sha'ban before Ramadan, it is written that Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi stood up after the sermon and said, Ya Rasulullah, ma afdalul a'mal fi shahr Ramadan. What is the best deed that we can commit during the month of Ramadan? And the Holy Prophet responded, Al-wara'u an maharimillah. If we can establish during the month of Ramadan, create or generate some kind of a spiritual power that we stop ourselves from committing sins and becoming forgetful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a huge achievement. It's a step in the right direction. So, Sawm al-Muttaqeen is a fast that we become conscious of everything that we do, everything that we say, everything we look at, everything we hear, and etc., and how we behave towards others. Now, if you look at a hadith that we have regarding this particular type of Sawm, they have focused on a number of deeds that the person who fasts should observe. Imam Sajjad, salawatullah salam alayhi, in one of the hadith, talks about at least 7 characteristics that we have to have. Number 1, to celebrate the arrival of the month of Ramadan, not to think about the month of Ramadan as a burden. Look at the dua Sahifa Sajjadiyah, how Imam Zain al-Abidin, salawatullah salam alayhi, talks to the month of Ramadan, welcomes the month of Ramadan. And at the end of the month, how he laments the fact that Ramadan is going to depart. It's as if a loved one is going to go away. So welcome the arrival of the month of Ramadan and celebrate the arrival of the month of Ramadan. Check on your neighbors. Those who are living around you, make sure that they are okay. Make sure that iftar is from halal source. If you break your fast and iftar is not from halal source, the idea that fasting is going to produce some kind of spiritual elevation is not going to work. So make sure that at least iftar that you have has been prepared and purchased from a halal source. Pay the poor their due. There are a huge number of poor and the needy within our community. Here, and other places. There is not a day that we receive requests for assistance. In Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, in other places. People are desperate. Why? Economic imbalance is not a given part of human nature. It's an artificial construction. When the rights of the poor are not given to them, then naturally the have and the have-nots are going to exist. But if we pay their rights, their dues, during the month of Ramadan is one of those. A huge number of scholars would make the month of Ramadan as the Ra's al-Sana al-Khumsiyya, first of the month of Ramadan, as the beginning of the month in which they identified their khums and paid their zakat, etc., etc. Those who have distanced themselves from you, you take the initiative and go towards them for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether it is in the context of family, Salatul Rahim, or in context of friends and distant relatives or acquaintances, that for whatever reasons the relationship has dropped, you take the initiative for the sake of Ramadan to go forward. Be just and fair in dealing with other people. Unfortunately, one of the problems that we have, we would like other people to be fair to us, but we never are fair to other people. The golden rule that says, do to others as you would like others to do to yourself. That is a critical issue. Cover for other people's secrets. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does it. We have to be mindful of that. So cover for other people's secret as well. These are, and if you look at a hadith that we have, these are huge huge literature we have regarding the characteristics of a person who's going to fast. But with regard to now moving on into Sawm al-Arifin, Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi talks about Sawm al-Arifin when not only we don't struggle to achieve cleanliness or to clean our souls, what we have, the thought of sin never comes to our mind. That's the highest level. We achieve some kind of power that we never even think about sinfulness and forgetfulness. This is only, for us, it's a dream. Remains, if we can move away from Sawm al-Fiqhi into some kind of cleansing of ourselves and removing of some of the sins that we have, it's a huge achievement. But to think of reaching a point in which falsehood has no notion and no perception, we have no perception of falsehood, and غير Allah, ma sawallah, in our heart, that is something that only few can do. And one of the hadith that we have regarding from Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi reminds us, all of us, that this is a unique opportunity. Allah has laid down the banquet. Allah is the host. We are the guests. We have to prepare ourselves ready for this ma'idah and the banquet in a manner that deserves that banquet and ma'idah. So begin, it says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created you to become the vicegerent, Khalifatullah on earth. Don't allow shaitan to control your soul and nafs al-ammara to control yourself, and ultimately you have sold yourself cheaply. Why? Because the true buyer is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not anybody else. This is the month in which we're supposed to understand truly who we are and the purpose where we've come. The three critical questions: min ayn, ila ayn, wa fi ayn. this dynamic between where we have come from, where we are now, and where we are going to end. The month of fasting is a unique occasion that, inshallah, tomorrow night we will continue with the conversation and lead ultimately, how can we turn this ordinary fast of ours into a spiritual fast that we benefit from it, inshallah. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant all of you the privilege of true fasting during this month and to accept your prayers and fasting as well. Please keep everybody else in your mind. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.